Hey, Eric. Hey, Jennifer.
Good
How do you
morning.
do?
Morning.
We're excited to have you here. We're excited. If you've checked out the page at all, you probably have an understanding of what we're all about.
Our level of interest
I
in
did
this
check
movie.
out the page. It's very impressive.
So, Jeff, before we get started, real quick, at the time, were you an executive VP, an executive? I want to make sure I give like a proper introduction. Um,
I wish I knew. And the reason I say I wish I knew is I'm actually not in my house right now. Anything I could reference, I don't have
that's fine.
accessible. But it does get to something worth saying, which is to a large degree, titles are meaningless in the film business. And what I mean by that is, as an executive, there's really three levels in terms of what you do.
Uh-huh.
There is what I would call the entry level executive, who generally is assigned all the work that the more senior executives don't want to do. And it's training wheels. The next level of executive is pretty much where every executive, from vice president to senior executive vice president, whatever you want to call it, falls into. And those are executives who are, in essence, the lead executives on films that are being developed and are getting made.
Hmm.
As one of those executives, so I am very guilty of this. You will call it, you will say it's my movie and I made this. And the truth is, it is your movie from a corporate level, but in reality, you're a kind of tourist on the movie.
Sure.
You're not there every single day, um, but you are a kind of general contractor who is making sure that the studio gets what it thinks it's going to get
Uh-huh.
at a price it expects to pay for it.
Right.
And you are making decisions about who's going to work on it. You're making decisions about the script. You're watching dailies. You're visiting the set and giving guidance. And depending on the movie, you may be more or less involved. And then the third and final level of executive is the executive or team of executives who has the authority to pull the trigger on it, whether you're going to spend 200 million or 300 million dollars making something.
Hmm. Right.
And oftentimes those executives are so busy with financial organizational issues that they are not very deeply involved in the production of any given movie. They're trusting that to their various VPs. But they are the ones who are ultimately saying yes or no to the big financial decisions.
Definitely. Well, going back to a point that you made about sometimes you say this is my movie and I made this movie. We'll get to some of that here in a moment because I think Hackers may be a stark example of where this movie certainly would not have happened without you. But some very interesting details around that. But before we go there, Jeff, when is the last time you watched Hackers?
Not since it came out.
Wow.
And that has nothing to do with Hackers. That has everything to do with me. I
Right.
find, I find it very difficult to watch any movie I've ever worked on after I no longer am required to watch it. Not simply because when I'm watching it after it's been completed, when there's no longer an opportunity to tweak or reshoot or fiddle with anything, all I see are what are, to my mind, the mistakes and the missed opportunities.
Sure.
So I've worked on a bunch of movies, and I know a lot of the movies I've worked on are terrific movies. I know that I know they're great. I'm actually very proud to have worked on them. I'm very happy to have done that, but I can't watch them because I watch them differently from the way anybody else watches them.
That
Yeah, that
makes
makes
sense.
complete sense.
Now I do have an addendum to this, which I know is coming up. I have two kids who are 8 and 11 years old. My 11-year-old has asked me about Hackers because she's seen some memorabilia around the house. And I
Nice.
know that sometime in the next few years, I will start showing the movies I've worked on to them. Uh, until I had kids, most of the things I worked on weren't really appropriate for kids,
Sure.
like
Yeah.
kids. Um, but my kids are now getting to that age where they are ready to start seeing Hackers and James Bond movies and Birdcage, and maybe not leaving Las Vegas yet, but some other stuff.
Definitely.
That's going to be so interesting to see it through their eyes of a completely different generation.
It will. I don't know how I'm going to feel emotionally, because I will still see the missed opportunities and the mistakes, but I will also be showing the kids things that were very important to me in my life. So it'll be interesting.
Jeff, I want to talk a little bit about how this whole thing got started. So if I understand the story correctly, you had met with Rafael, who wrote the script for Hackers, before it was written. And the introduction to him sounds like a pretty interesting story. Can you tell us a little bit about how the two of you met?
Yeah, so I was an executive at Paramount. At the time, the head of production was a man named Sid Ganis. And I don't remember why, but Sid and I were on a trip to New York. And this was somewhere between December of 1990 and February of 1991. And Sid was staying at the recently revamped Royalton Hotel. And
Oh
I
my
was
gosh.
staying, yeah, it was the new hot trendy hotel that had been completely redesigned. And Sid called me up and he said, Jeff, you just got to come over and take a look at this place. This will put you back in the early 1990s. It's amazing. It's incredible. You just come in and have a drink. Just see what it's like. I said, okay. So I went to what was, I believe was their champagne and vodka lounge.
Nice.
And it looked like anything you would sit on might hurt you. It was that sharp angled. I went up to the bar and I ordered a drink, and it was completely empty. And the woman behind the bar started up a conversation with me. And one of the things that I was feeling very strongly at the time, and actually continue to feel, is how insular Hollywood is. And what I mean by that is, I graduated college in '86. So at this point, I'm about 4 years out of college. And in college, you'll go to dinner and you'll sit at a dining table, and there'll be a molecular biology and biochemistry major, a Russian history major, a European literature major, an Asian studies major. And you'll talk, and they'll be from all over the world, and you'll talk about everything under the sun.
Right.
And then you come out to Los Angeles, which is one of those cities that is dominated by a single industry.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, nothing was online. So you had two physical trade newspapers every day, Variety and the Hollywood Reporter. And they had no news of the outside world unless it somehow directly affected cinemas or film or TV. And suddenly conversations just shrunk to being only about the movie business and nothing else. And even then, I was excited to get out to LA and talk about the movie business, or to talk about movie aesthetics.
Yeah.
But that wasn't what we were talking about. We were talking about deals and gossip, basically.
Yeah.
So to me, who I am frankly fairly introverted, I will not walk up to a party and start having a conversation with someone. To be sitting there and having someone starting to talk to me and talking about things that we didn't talk about in Los Angeles or Hollywood was a real breath of fresh air.
Nice break. Yeah, absolutely.
And we talked for a long while. And at a certain point, she said, I'm sure you're really busy, but if you were ever free for lunch and wanted to have lunch with my husband and me, that'd be lovely. And I thought, well, why not?
Yeah.
It is kind of a good, refreshing thing to just go have lunch with people when it's not about work. So I did. A few days later, I met her and her husband, Rafael, for lunch. And it was terrific. And we became good friends. And whenever I would come to New York, I would see them. And I was in New York the following year or later that year over Thanksgiving. And I went to their very tiny apartment and had Thanksgiving dinner with them. And they're just fantastic. So during all this time, Raphael was always interested in movies, and he was working, I believe, as a reader or story editor, or it was a very entry-level position somewhere. And I knew, was always interested in writing, was always writing, working on writing something, but I had never read his writing.
Mm-hmm.
And one trip to New York, he said, "I've finally finished a script. Would you be willing to read it?" And I said, "Of course."
Obviously, we know that the hacker script is the result of this, but had you had any experience with computers, like before you read the script, to get a picture of where your sort of knowledge on the subject matter was before you read it?
So I was born in 1964.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that to, give you a sense that my childhood was not one where there were a lot of home computers.
Right.
My father, who loved Radio Shack, did buy a TRS-80, which was the early cassette player version of a home computer that Radio Shack created.
Yeah.
And we did have great fun playing with that. But the most interesting sort of anecdote in my young computer life was that the local high school had a terminal that connected to a Hewlett-Packard mainframe. And somehow I became friends with some kids who had become obsessed with this, and they had gotten a pass to allow them after school to go visit that terminal. And I tagged along with them, and I became obsessed. And I taught myself BASIC and Fortran, which were the languages at the time.
Yeah.
And we, played on the computer. We learned to basically print out images. We desperately tried to hack into the central education system and change our grades.
Yeah.
But most importantly, there was a game on the computer, essentially a Star Trek game, very rudimentary. And again, there's no screen for this computer. It's all printout.
Right.
And all of us loved playing the game. I was not a Trekkie, although I would later end up working on Star Trek 6, but that's a different story. But I loved playing games, and I loved the game. We all loved the game. It was pretty much the only game you could play on the computer. But we were also very frustrated by it because we were so aware of its limitations.
Oh, yeah.
So the science fair was coming up, and one of my friends' dad worked at IBM. And Larry said, "If you want to do a science fair project with me where we basically fix this game, we make it, we improve upon it, my dad will give us access to some IBM computers." And I said, "Sure." So we spent months with the computing power that was far beyond anything we'd had access to on the terminal, that far beyond what any kid would have had access to at that point. We're in the 1970s here. And we came up with what we believed was just an astonishing light years ahead version of this game, which we presented at the science fair. And we were really proud. We were incredibly proud of the work. And the judges came by, far from praising us, became furious with us. They read us the riot act. They thought that what we had done was immoral. They said that to have access to that kind of computing power, to these kinds of instruments, and to waste them in service of creating a game was one of the most egregious things they had ever seen in the history of science fairs.
Wow.
It would not be the first time that people make this mistake in history, right?
Yeah. And
Wow.
And so when you ask what was my prior history with computers, it was deeply fascinated. And then after that, being just completely shut down.
I feel like you may have had a little more experience and kind of insight into the world that Hackers is creating than a lot of the other people who were interested in this movie. So I'm really curious, when you read the script, what did you think? What did you gravitate towards? Was there something particular that sold this idea for you?
The first is during the time of when I first met Rafael and I was at Paramount, I had left Paramount and I had gone to work for Francis Ford Coppola. Mm-hmm. So there's there's a difference in sensibility between the kinds of movies Paramount was looking for when I left, and the kinds of movies Francis and I were interested in when I was working for him. And I say that because if I had read Hackers when I was at Paramount, I might not, I might have been really helpful to Rafael, but I might not have gone as far with it as I did.
Mm-hmm.
Because Francis, first of all, loves technology, loves it. When we were making Dracula, if a new fax machine showed up, Francis would call cut and leave the set for 15 minutes to go play with the new fax machine because he was so excited about it. Francis was the first person professionally I ever dealt with in Hollywood who had an email account and actually responded to the email, and you could get him to respond faster by emailing than with a phone call.
Oh, wow.
Fascinating.
So, the difference in getting this script when you're at Paramount and they are making relatively down the middle, some excellent, but still relatively down the middle mainstream movies, and you're with Francis, who not only is obsessed with technology, but loves being fresh, is really interested in what he thinks of as future generations. There's no accident his having made The Outsiders and Rumblefish, and cast them as brilliantly as he did. This was a script that, as soon as I read it, I felt it absolutely hit the bullseye in terms of the kind of things that Francis and I got excited about.
Mm-hmm.
When I got the first draft, of course, very, very rarely is there a brilliant, this is ready to get made or even ready to get bought first draft.
Right.
Particularly from a first-time writer.
Mm-hmm.
And the first draft showed tremendous potential, but there was work to be done, mm-hmm. as there is with everybody. So initially, the very first thing I did when I read the script, which I really enjoyed, was say to Raph, this is fantastic. I'm not saying it because I'm your friend. I'm saying it because I genuinely mean it. And if you want to rewrite it, I've got a lot of thoughts and ideas, which I can give you and you can take or leave. But, if you sort of want to know what the point of view is going to be from some of the people in the industry who read it, I can represent that and help you shape this. And I said, and the reason I'm offering, this is, again, not because I'm your friend, but because I think this is worth putting the effort into. And so we did, I don't know how many drafts, and by we did, he did all the writing. Mm-hmm. I just gave him a lot of notes. But also as part of doing the notes, Raph, when he wrote the script, he had already done a lot of research. He had gone to a lot of hacker meetings. He'd been reading 2200. He had interviewed a bunch of hackers at the time. We leaned into that as much as possible. And again, I don't want to oversell what I did here. I gave him the guidance of someone who had worked on a whole bunch of movies and a whole bunch of scripts, mm-hmm. and had, you could say, a bigger picture of the playing field. But this was his original idea, and he really did the legwork to not just imagine it, but to make sure there was a lot of truth behind it. And he also put in the time to just keep working on that script over and over and over again till it got to the point where I said to him, I think this is amazing. I think Francis is going to love this. I'd like to get Sony to option this, and then let's put it together with a really strong director and get it made.
Right.
And Rafael was thrilled. I mean, that you write your first script and you don't really know anybody in the movie industry, and suddenly there's Francis Ford Coppola is going to produce your movie for Sony. Yeah. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he said, sure. He said, yeah, that'd be fantastic. Absolutely. And Rafael is not the first-time writer that I have taken under my wing. Uh-huh. And I know or knew or believed, if you are guiding someone through this process, both ethically and also because you're doing it because you think they're talented and you want to work with them for a long time. You want to make sure they're never going to look back on the experience and feel like they were taken advantage of,
Sure.
no matter how good an opportunity it may be. And while I would do my best in the negotiation for his script to make sure that he was paid a fair option price and a fair purchase price and everything else, I am not a lawyer, I am not an agent, and there are probably some unconscious biases because I am on the side of the producer and I am on the side of the studio. Right. And so I said to him, before we make a deal, you need to have an agent. And I said, and I can help you get an agent, but you need to have an agent because you need somebody who is watching out solely for you. So I called an agent I liked quite a lot at William Morris. I told her about Raf, and she referred me to a New York William Morris agent. He signed on to be her client. At this point, I thought things would be pretty simple. I would have lawyers enter into a negotiation to make a deal for the project, and we'd be off and running. The lawyers reached out, they made an offer, and there was silence, which was really weird. And at a certain point, I called up and I said, what's going on? And she says, well, there's another producer who wants the project. And they've made an offer. I said, oh, that's surprising. How did any other producers see it? And, what's the offer? And she said, I'm not going to tell you what the offer is. She said, but why don't you just say a number? And if the number is more than the offer, then we'll sell it to you. But if the number is less than the offer, we'll sell it to Michael. And I said, I really don't understand this. We can only have the project if we guess a magic number. Right. And as you can imagine, Francis's lawyers and Sony's lawyers were not amused. We want nothing to do with it. This is not how we engage in business.
Totally.
And walked away. I remained with Francis for a couple more years. He decided he was going, or at least his plan was, to go to Northern California and direct theater for a year. And the thing one of the things to understand about Francis, while he's not known to the world as a theater director, he really sees theater as the foundation that he built a lot of his skill set on. And he offered me a job, but I was still young and very ambitious, and I was not quite ready to be more the man of leisure up in Northern California instead of trying to make my way getting movies made in Hollywood. So Francis headed up north. There was an executive who oversaw our deal at Sony named Gareth Wigan, and Gareth said to me, do you know John Calley? And I didn't know John Calley. I knew who he was. John was legendary. Gareth said, John's coming out of retirement and he's going to take over United Artists. And Gareth said, you should just meet with John. So I did. Nice. I went in, I met with John. He offered me a job in the room. And so right then and there, I said, great, I'm coming over to United Artists. I could do days and days on all the different ways that John was wonderful. But one of the many ways that John was wonderful was, unlike most studios or most people in the industry, his belief was that the reason he hired you was to think differently than he did. Mm-hmm. If you and he had the exact same taste, then he didn't need you. He already had himself. And so if you were going to be his executive, he expected you to bring in projects that you were passionate about, that he might not normally have gravitated toward, and that he would trust you until you were proven wrong.
Right.
Because he knew he had to appeal to a much broader audience than simply himself.
Certainly.
This led to UA doing a wild variety of projects. Nobody could figure us out. There were no rules. The only rule was, are you passionate and excited about this?
Right.
And if you are, it was go do it your way, don't do it by committee. So around this time, Rafael pops up. Oh, in the intervening 2-3 years, nothing had happened with Hackers. And as far as I was concerned, it had become only more relevant in the intervening years.
Yeah.
Right.
So I said to Raf, I'd be very interested in it. In fact, I can pretty much tell you that we would make it. If you get a different agent to handle the negotiations, I will go negotiate a deal for the movie. But, and I don't care who that agent is. I'm not going to tell you who has to represent you. Again, I want you well represented, but it can't be her. And so he did. He went and got a different agent at William Morris to do it. And we made the deal, which is a very long-winded, but it is a long and windy road to how Hackers ended up at United Artists.
Nice. So at the end of the day, United Artists does end up with the script. Can you tell us a little bit what the process was like after the studio acquires the script in order to get production started?
Yeah. So John and I both have strong auteurist beliefs surrounding directors. We do not like directors who are really solid but don't have a clear, distinct voice. And we very strongly support and always wanted to bring directors to our projects who may or may not build the most perfectly constructed house, but would build the most uniquely constructed house on the block. And around the time that we were finishing the acquisition of the script for Hackers, John and I got to see before it was released Backbeat, Ian Softley's first movie.
Right.
And we flipped for it. We just thought it was a superb, fantastic, wonderful movie. We thought, and I still do, feel Ian was the real thing with a very distinctive voice. John was really direct. There was no game playing. There was no beating around the bush. And he was very inventive. He didn't mind breaking any of the rules. So we got Ian's phone number, and John said to Ian, well, we love Backbeat. We've got the script. We'll send it to you. If you like it, we will make a pay or play deal with you right now. Unheard of for a director who is not Steven Spielberg or James Cameron,
right.
or for a movie that isn't already packaged and ready to go. What it essentially means is we will pay you whether or not we make this movie. We will pay your full fee.
Wow.
If you say you want to make this. If it gets made, great. And if it doesn't get made within a certain amount of time, we'll still pay you your full fee. Which is a tremendous incentive to say yes.
Yes, pretty easy decision, I'd say. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Particularly when you've made one indie movie and never worked with a major studio before. And an indie movie that is respected and loved, but didn't financially set the world on fire.
You must have thought, what in the world is going on?
Yes. So Ian reads the script, and Ian comes back and basically says, so it's kind of like Backbeat, but instead of guitars, they have computers. The computers are the guitars. And we said, exactly. And he said, fantastic, I'm in. Now, the most treacherous moment for a writer on a film is when a director is hired. Notoriously, writers are replaced on feature films, particularly studio feature films. They are hired and fired a lot. But I loved Raph, and I thought he had a very specific voice that captured these kids in a way that I thought I couldn't think of any other writer who could. And so I went to John, and I said, John, how do we prevent this from happening? And John said, I have an idea. let's send Raph to J. Preston Allen. J. Preston Allen she's sadly deceased, a legendary writer. She was also a very close friend of John's. Mm-hmm. So we called her up and said, Jay, would you be willing to meet with this young writer and tell him how not to get fired? And she said, sure. So Raph went over to Jay's apartment in New York, and Jay gave Raph essentially a monologue to memorize and then go say to Ian, which she said would guarantee that Ian wouldn't fire him. And Raph did exactly as Jay said. And Ian said, he's my guy.
That's awesome.
Amazing.
Yes.
You were really looking out for him.
Well, but yes, but also he deserved it. He really, this wasn't an assignment that he had taken on. This wasn't something that he had fumbled in some way. It's just the system isn't always built to acknowledge and respect and reward that. And we at United Artists want to do things a little differently, but also do it in a way which worked within the system.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Well, so at this point, right? So now we've got the director. Mm-hmm. We've got our writer, right? And the writer and the director like each other. They're in it. John Calley's backed the film, so the film is going to be made.
Film's going to be made.
And now we get to casting.
There were a lot of actors cast in this film that later went on to great fame, maybe none more so than Angelina Jolie. But at that time, she was totally unknown, right? What was it like bringing her on board for her first major role?
So we hired a casting director in New York named Diane Crittenden. And Diane is fantastic. Diane and Ian, I don't remember where the idea came from Diane or from Ian first, because he was already known in the theater world in England, came up with the idea of John E. Lee Miller for the lead.
Right.
And we all fell in love with Johnny. I went to London and I saw him on stage in a play, and he is just amazing. We thought, this guy has real acting chops. And we specifically wanted an actor who did not come with any baggage, someone who really you could, to some degree, surf some of the questions about what it means to be a hacker. And we felt that Johnny had all of those things. So we knew we were casting Johnny, and Johnny signed on. And now the question was who to cast opposite him. And the decision was made that it should be Liv Tyler. Uh-huh. Liv was just making a big name for herself. She was the right age. She was considered marquee value. So the studio felt like there was something to bank on there. And particularly since we were casting an unknown male lead in their minds, having a female lead who, at least within the younger teen and 20-something demographic, would be known, was already somewhat known and would be known even more soon, was a great thing. So it was essentially, for all purposes, it was going to be Liv. She wanted to do it. That I remember is she had said, okay. And then Diane sends us a casting tape. She had been just auditioning and cold calling people and bringing them in. He sends us a casting tape of Angelina. And she had liked Angelina so much that she actually had Angelina read with Johnny. Mm-hmm. And it was this really, it was this badly lit, video from the early 1990s of them in this very dull room, one stationary camera on a tripod way too far back, and they're reading the scene together. And it was electrifying. You couldn't take your eyes off of them. The chemistry was genuinely palpable. And Ian saw this and said, it's got to be her. And I saw it and felt the exact same way. It had to be this actress who none of us had heard of, whose only real credit was Cyborg 2.
Right.
But not only was she great and compelling, the combination of her and Johnny was insane. So take the tape to John Calley and go in with all the caveats of, I know we want Liv Tyler, I know she wants to do this, I know has some genuine marquee value and Johnny doesn't, but you have to look at this. And again, to John's credit, he looked at it, he said, okay, go with her. With Angelina Jolie.
Wow.
And we did. And as I'm sure you know, that chemistry was so palpable and so real that when the movie finished production, Johnny and Angelina got married.
That's right, yeah.
Right. And you could see it in that very first audition.
That's awesome. Well, another quick question on casting. A rumor we just heard in our recent interview with Fisher Stevens that maybe you can dispel. Was Quentin Tarantino ever in the running to be the Plague?
The answer is, we talked about it a little bit. So I know Quentin a bit. Before Quentin had made Reservoir Dogs, there's a theater that Quentin now owns, but this is going back to the 80s. In the 80s was called the New Beverly. It was a revival house. And I'm movie obsessed, much the way Quentin is, just not. And I used to go to the New Beverly all the time when I first got to Hollywood. And I was at a Sam Fuller double feature one night. It was the intermission. And this guy and I got to talking. And that guy was Quentin. But at the time, Quentin hadn't written or made anything. We just Sam Fuller fans. We were just big New Beverly. New Beverly a bunch of times. And we became friends. And in the very early days, we stayed in touch. He came over to my house. And I say that saying, it's not that we're no longer friends at this point. We've just completely lost touch with each other.
Right.
But that was still the relatively early days. And by that point, Quentin was Quentin Tarantino.
Right.
But we were still in touch. And I knew Quentin was interested in acting. And I wanted to do something interesting with Plague. And so I did talk to Quentin about it. Quentin, I believe, I don't remember what the conflict was, but there was a logistical problem or issue we worked out. And for us, logistically, we couldn't work out the issue. And so it didn't happen. But when it wasn't going forward with Quentin, I thought about another pal of mine, which was Penn Jillette.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
And this was not for Fisher's role. I really became obsessed with the idea of putting Penn somewhere in the movie. And so that's how, again, another not sort of typical actor ended up in the movie. What was fun about Penn is the British crew were so excited when he was arriving. They would keep saying, "The Conjurer is coming. The Conjurer." The Conjurer.
They're trying to make him do card tricks and stuff on backstage, I'm sure.
I'm sure.
So at this point, production has started. Probably, filming maybe even has started at this point. At that point in a production, how much control does really the studio still have, or maybe in this case on Hackers, maybe specifically, or was it like you mentioned? We're all in, Ian, make this movie and do what you want to do?
Well, for a traditional studio movie, the studio would have total control. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is Ian is still a very young novice director. He does not have final cut. The studio is bankrolling the movie, and if there's a real knockdown, drag out fight between him and the studio can fire him. Mm-hmm. And I've seen directors fired off of quite a few movies. Mm-hmm. So yeah, if this was, again, a typical studio, he might or might not have a fair amount of control. But this is United Artists. And John Callie and I are both completely in love with Ian and Ian's vision. And we are, for the most part, in lockstep with Ian in terms of what he wants to do. I learned actually a very important lesson on Hackers.
Mm-hmm.
There was one scene in the shooting script that I loved and Ian did not.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't like the scene. And you're going to ask me which scene it was, and I don't remember. But he did not like the scene at all. I pulled studio weight and I said, man, it is a fantastic scene. You may not like it, you may not get it, but you've got to shoot it. You know, we can always cut it in post, but you know, we're paying for this movie. We will pay, you know, for this to be shot.
Right.
It's a brilliant scene. You must shoot it. And so Ian shot it, and Ian shot it sincerely. There was, he gave it as much time and attention, energy, and care as he gave everything else in the movie. But when I saw the scene in dailies, it wasn't very good.
Mm-hmm.
And what I suddenly realized, which has served me very well ever since then, is I can love a scene dearly, but if the director, who is the one who actually has to have a vision for it that's going to end up on screen, doesn't share that exact same vision,
Mm-hmm.
my vision, whatever I'm imagining in my head, is not what's going to end up on screen. So with Ian, I would say we agreed 95% of the time. And the 5% of the time we didn't agree, we either let him do it his way, or as is the case with that scene, which never ended up in the final cut of the film, you know, I learned about not mistaking what I'm imagining in my head for being what someone else is imagining in their heads, and trying to figure out if you bridge that or if it's even bridgeable.
Right.
But yes, we had a lot of stuff that was going on, and a lot of things that were rolling the dice that were not typical. Ian wanted to shoot the movie, even though it was based in New York, primarily in London. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that financially, it made sense to shoot the majority of the movie in London. We shot a little bit in New York. And what we shot in New York was spectacular. But Ian was convinced that he could give us everything we needed in London, and that it would have a slightly, it would have a look to it that, and a feel to it, because we shot in London, that would not make people believe it wasn't New York, right, but would make it feel like a New York they hadn't seen before. Now, again, you've got a guy who's made one movie, and you're guessing that this approach can make sense and that he can modulate that. When it came to wardrobe, he decided that he wanted the kids to dress, as he put it, what their guess would be was 15 seconds into the future. Right. That they didn't dress like any high school students anywhere in the world actually dressed. But again, they shouldn't dress so far off that it took you out of the movie. Right. I will jump ahead to say the payoff to this was we research screened the movie in San Diego. And at the end of the research screening, during the focus group, we asked what they thought of the way the kids were dressed. Uh-huh. And the first respondent said, "It's not the way we dress." And then someone else piped in, "Yeah, but maybe that's the way they dress in New York." And all the real kids start saying, "Yeah, maybe that's how they dress in New York." And you can see the sort of envy and desire, sort of fantasy of, "Oh my gosh, I bet that would be so cool. They're so much cooler than we are in New York. That must be how they do it."
Oh, that's amazing.
I will say it wasn't long after that camouflage really started making an appearance in high school, being a high schooler at the time.
That is true. So it sounds like you guys really put a lot of trust in Ian's vision. Was Was there anything that you ended up being unhappy with?
There's no movie I've ever worked on that I haven't ended up having things I'm unhappy with. But yes, we put a lot of trust in Ian's vision, but also, and this is, I think this invokes the trust. Ian was always very open with us about what his vision was.
Mm-hmm.
So there was nothing mysterious about Ian's vision. There were things where, wow, can you really pull that off in a way that works? Because one of the big things the director has to do that there's nobody else on set to really do is control tone. And the greatest directors manage to find unique, specific tones that, sometimes you look and you think, wow. And so with Ian, there were a lot of things he wanted to do that were going to make this different from the typical high school movie of its time, that were really breaking the rules. And we understood that, and we were excited about it. And we just chose to roll the dice on it because we thought that would be more interesting than if we just went the conventional route.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of being disappointed, and this is not Ian's fault, it's not the script's fault, it's not the actor's fault. I really believe it was a confluence of different things. One thing that often happens in movies, particularly with child or teen protagonists, is the adult characters end up becoming caricatures.
Mm.
A little cartoonish. And personally, I don't like that. I actually think it's more interesting when the adults feel as real and genuine as the teen and the kid characters, but are just generationally, or morally or philosophically looking at things in a different way.
Right.
And we developed the script originally with that intent, that Plague really was an older version of Johnny, who was coming at it from a different philosophical angle, but he was just as real and just as intelligent and just as interesting as Johnny was. And the same would be true for Lorraine Bracco's character or any of the other adult characters in the movie. And I think we got pretty close with Johnny's mom, but I think we got pretty close with her. I feel like she feels like a pretty genuine and multifaceted, and she's neither the hectoring mom nor the overly cool mom. She's actually a decent woman with a sense of humor who's just trying to find her way through a very difficult parenting situation.
That's very true.
But I feel with our villains, we got a little caricaturish. And again, it's not the fault of our cast. It's just we fell into what I think are some traps of the conventions. In a way, we spent so much time making sure our teens were as interesting and multifaceted and fun and emotional as possible, that we didn't give those same resources to all of our adult characters. And I wish we'd managed to do that. But one of the things about making a movie is you're spending a lot of money very fast, and that money is not unlimited. And in this case, while I'm sure the movie looks very dated today, what we were trying to do with the effects and with the motion control cameras was state of the art.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, a lot of the stuff with the moving through circuits and the motion, and using models and motion controlling the cameras through the models, because a lot of that is not CGI.
Right.
That was really difficult and tricky to do. And it was easy for all of us who had never done that exactly before to sometimes get distracted and not manage to be completely omniscient 100% of the time about every aspect of the movie. And I feel like they got the short shrift there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have to say, I really don't think that the movie looks dated because it looks like something that has a vision that was unique. And I feel like those kind of artistic visions hold up over time, regardless of the effects. The effects still look pretty cool.
I think so. I think like Ian's idea of having New York turn into a circuit board where Johnny's flying over it still feels exciting to me.
Yeah,
So iconic.
totally.
I was just looking at this non-scripted series Netflix has called The Circle, and I was watching the opening episode, and they do some shots if it was, which feel to me completely hackers inspired. They may not know they're hackers inspired. People have been hackers inspired things that they may think they're riffing off of what is now just a convention, but they're shots that I believe we did for the first time in Hackers. So it's definitely it's had a huge influence whether people are aware of it or not.
So production's happening. How much? And you mentioned, that in a traditional sense, that the studio would be very, very involved. How much were you personally still involved while filming was taking place?
More involved than usual.
Uh-huh.
And there were a few reasons for that. One was during pre-production, there were some creative differences between Michael Pizer and Ian. And as I said earlier, John and I tend to be extremely supportive of directors. And given that they were not seeing eye to eye, ultimately we had to ask Michael, who was a very experienced producer, to step away.
Mm-hmm.
And we brought in a producer I'd worked with on Star Trek VI named Ralph Winter, who is also a wonderful producer. But Ralph was jumping onto a moving train. And we also retained a woman who worked for Michael named Janet Graham, now Janet Graham Borba, who was also a wonderful producer. She had to navigate still working for Michael while also being present on a movie that he wasn't present on, and having a new producer in Ralph who was the more authoritative producer than her boss.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was an unusual situation, again, particularly with a relatively new director by studio terms. So it was felt that the studio needed to have someone there most of the time just to make sure that everybody meshed.
Right.
This wasn't a case where the film had been put together by a core group of people, and that core group of people had been together months, maybe even years prior to the movie starting to shoot. This was a case where there were a lot of really great people who all had really strong visions, who all had to figure out their relationships with each other while in motion.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so I was very present. I was very present in both New York and in London.
So the film has been made at some point and it's being released to theaters. Can you tell us a little bit what that experience is like and what the next few months would be like?
Well, so that experience was very disappointing. Mm-hmm. We made a movie which we felt had a lot of amazing elements. Starting with Raf's script, which we did feel was fresh and spoke to a generation that movies weren't speaking to, spoke to what we believed was the contemporary world and where the world was heading in a way that movies hadn't been addressing, done with a really great style that Ian brought to it, visually, musically, energetically. We thought we had a cast that was more interesting and genuine and varied. I mean, this is long before you used words like diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
And so we weren't using words like that, but we were just saying, how we felt like our cast was representing the youth of America in a way that was more genuine and interesting than a lot of other movies were at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And So we were thrilled about all this. And most importantly, from my point of view, what I was really excited about was that there was no other movie addressing any of this by the time we wrapped and were ready to go into the theaters. What I mean by that is Virtuosity, The Net, and Johnny Mnemonic not only hadn't come out yet, they weren't ready to come out when we were ready.
Right.
However, for all the innovativeness of John Calley, John does not run marketing and distribution. And marketing and and there is frequently with studios a lot of tension between the production arm and the marketing and distribution arms.
Mm-hmm.
Production always blames marketing and distribution when a movie doesn't work. You should have sold it better. And marketing and distribution always blames production with, why did you give us this movie that's unsellable? Why can't you give us something that is easy?
Yeah.
And both have, validity in their opinion. But I'm on the production side. So in this story, I'm going to blame marketing and distribution. Because what happened was marketing and distribution was populated with people who did not understand technology, particularly at least in terms of what was on the horizon and what was, and weren't especially interested in it. And they thought that the movie was incomprehensible. They really believed, and I think they genuinely believed, audiences wouldn't get it. They wouldn't understand what it was about or what was going on or what was happening. And what John and I kept trying to say to them is, audiences of your generation won't get it, but it's not for them. You're right. Your friends will not get this, but their kids will. And, again, it gets back to John's philosophy of, I don't make movies solely for myself. I make them for people who think differently from me, and I hire people who think differently from me. But from the market and distribution point of view, they were terrified of it. They truly thought it would just come across as gibberish that had no relevance.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew Virtuosity and The Net and Johnny Mnemonic were on the horizon. The movie industry does a very good job of watching what everybody else is doing.
Yeah.
And their philosophy was, we need to let those movies come out first to teach the audience what Hackers is. Because until those movies have come out and taught the audience about these things, the audience won't be able to get their heads around Hackers. Our philosophy, our counterpoint was, hold on, as innovative as we think Hackers is, let's be clear, War Games preceded Hackers by 12 years.
Right.
We are not doing something that is so out of the box weird that there is no precedent for it in the audience's imagination or knowledge. But production side does not have final say in marketing and distribution. And so they decided to wait. And Virtuosity came out, which personally I think sucked.
Yeah.
And The Net came out, which was fun and well made, but felt a little fake in a lot of what it was purporting.
Mm-hmm.
And Johnny Mnemonic came out, which I also thought pretty much sucked. And you got to remember, they came out something like, I don't know, May, July, August. And then we came out in September. I can't tell you exactly what was in the audience's head, but I know that if I had been an audience member who had had nothing to do with Hackers and knew nothing about it, I would have been burnt out by the time. And
Right.
so it, to my mind, really underperformed. The thing that overperformed was its soundtrack, which did so well that we ended up releasing a second soundtrack inspired by Hackers.
Yep.
And then for me personally, it was sad because I really believed this movie, if it had been made in 1991 or 92, when I first wanted to make it, would have been extraordinary. With Francis, I think if we had gotten it out before those other movies, it might have found a real audience. But I just sort of felt like, well, there's a lot of things I like about this movie, and I know all the reasons I made it, and I still believe they were the right reasons, but it didn't work. And I felt
Totally.
that for a long time. And then I ended up teaching some courses at USC's graduate school in cinema. And and by that point I was teaching at USC, I had a pretty good resume of movies with movies that I knew were really beloved and potentially one day be classics. But the movie that my students cared most about was Hackers. And I was so surprised. And then I started to understand that my students at age 12, 13, or 14, maybe they first saw it on TV, as opposed to the theaters or VHS, but it had taken on a place in their imagination at that age, which was far larger than any of the what I would have thought of as the more significant movies I'd made. And it had really spoken to them in the way we had hoped the movie would speak to people. It just didn't happen, in a way that we were aware of when we first released it.
Right.
And
I imagine it must have been, you must have felt good at that point, or it must have been a little bit of vindication to realize that the movie had connected with people.
I did. I really did. And it's interesting, I'll call it the code of this last year, which is, Raph wrote another movie for us, which was Carrie 2, The Rage.
Uh-huh.
And that was a movie that did not perform well when it was released. But in the last year, it has had a huge resurgence.
Yes, it has.
And it feels like poor Raph was somehow cursed to always be a little ahead of his time. Yeah, a lot of the issues he was exploring in Carrie 2, and a lot of the things he was doing with Emily Bergel's character are now makes so much sense in the current cultural context in a way that they didn't resonate back when the movie was made in 98 or 99. Even though they were absolutely true then too.
Right, right. I'm sure that a lot of the things that we have latched onto about Hackers were qualities that you saw in the original script when you first read it. What are your thoughts on why exactly it's connected so well with fans?
To give a compliment to marketing and distribution. And I don't remember where it originally came from. I wish I did. But the tagline that ended up on the poster, "Their crime was curiosity,"
Mm-hmm.
that I have always genuinely loved. And I think, particularly as a parent now who has seen my kids go through the terrible twos where you tell them don't stick your finger in the light socket, and they just lock eyes with you and keep moving their finger closer and closer and closer to the light socket to see what's going to happen if they break the rules, and how far they can get. I think there is something baked into the human psyche, and it is actually what creates progress in our world and creates hope that each new generation is going to make the world a better rather than a worse place, is that when you are particularly a teenager and you are trying to figure out your own identity and you have been given all of these rules, you're also asking the question of, well, what are the loopholes, or what are the things that are wrong about these rules, or what are the things that are now irrelevant about these rules because the world has changed, or we can, most importantly, change the world in a way that makes these rules that we don't like irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't, and while it may be heady to say that those are the questions the movie is asking, I do believe that those are the motives that are driving our characters in the movie. And I can't think of many, if any, other teen movies that have characters that are on some level driven by those questions. And I think that does resonate. I also think Ian put it together. He chose department heads and he had a vision for it that made it really engaging and fun so that, as you said earlier, it doesn't feel dated. I'm suspecting that when I show it to my kids in a year or two, it's going to be very compelling to look at and listen to. You're going to want to keep looking and listening because Ian did it in a way that makes you not want to look away.
Very true.
Totally.
For our cast too. I mean, you don't want to take your eyes off any of them. My maybe the biggest mystery to me is why all of them aren't as big as Angelina.
Has no one approached the studio with Hackers 2 yet? I mean, that thought has certainly come up in a number of our interviews with other cast and crew members.
The studio has considered making Hackers 2. I was not involved, but I do know that in the early 2000s, the studio realized that Hackers as a title still did quite well for them. There was a lot of interest in sales around the world. Much to the studio's surprise, there was always somebody saying, hey, we'd like to license Hackers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know they explored or talked about doing what I believe, because this was back in the days when there was a genuine straight-to-video business, a straight-to-video Hackers 2. And I don't know what the plot line was they had in mind, but I do know it was on their books for a while as we're planning to make a Hackers 2 as a straight-to-video film.
That's really cool. That's really cool.
From your perspective as a producer, what would it take to get a project like that off the ground now?
Well, for me, it would be having a reason or a way of doing it that felt as fresh and exciting as the first one did when I got excited about the first one.
Mm-hmm.
The question for me with Hackers 2 or any sequel is not what's the money grab, but what is the reason that it is going to be, even if there wasn't a previous movie, what's exciting about making this movie and what's the dialogue it will have with the previous movie that would be a really interesting conversation between the two movies.
Well, Jeff, we'll ask this next question to wrap up the interview, but we'll ask if we can hold you for a few side questions after that. But first, I wanted to thank you on behalf of Hackers fans everywhere. This film has quite literally directed aspects of my life personally, as well as many of our fellow fans. And I think the arguments can pretty easily be made that there are one or two technological developments over the years that certainly seem to stem back from this film or the influences that it had. Do you have any sort of final thoughts for fans of this film?
My only final thoughts are I'm so glad you're out there. It is a really great feeling to know that even if it didn't have a huge immediate reception, that the movie was worth making and that it mattered to some people in some way. I mean, that's why I do what I do. You want to believe that what you're working on is ultimately going to be meaningful to someone. And so the fact that it has been meaningful is fantastic.
Absolutely. I don't think it could have been better said.
Yeah, we're very grateful that it was made.
Thank you.